Then my students at American University very wisely said, you must add this question. What's the question? How often do you pretend to use your phone to avoid social contact? And I know this now has popped up in a number of countries where it's been studied. I'll show you the data. And then some open-ended questions that we'll get to. What were the open-ended questions? There was a word association task. What are the first 3 words you think of when you think of mobile phones? And I thank Leopoldina Fortunati for suggesting this question because it yielded fascinating data. Then I asked, what are the 2 most important uses for your mobile phone besides texting and talking? And those didn't prove to be as interesting. How have things changed? Largely in the United States, they're doing more texting, and in other countries. There are a variety of functions depending upon the sophistication of the handset. And then another question we will talk about today, what is the one thing you like most about having a mobile phone? What's the one thing you like least? And I was interested in general in what the results were, as well as what the cross-cultural findings were. Just a little snapshot of the findings, and then we'll get to some things in detail. The Swedish subjects were most comfortable of all those 5 countries in talking on their phone in public space. So when they're sitting in a cafe with friends, when they're on the bus, when they're walking down the street, they were more comfortable with anyone else saying it's fine to talk, which, if you know anything about Swedish culture, is very characteristic of live and let live. You can do what you want. There's not a lot of control of public behavior, except they control themselves very nicely with that. American subjects were highly evaluative both positively and negatively. They had a lot of comments to make, including they were complaining that other people were loud on their phones. When I looked when I summed together the data from all 5 countries, males versus females, they didn't complain a lot about other people being loud. Americans decided everybody else was too loud. Italians complained a lot about cost, and I was very curious about this. The Japanese complained about cost as well, but there's so many more functions you use with the keitai in Japan, maybe it's not surprising they're complaining about cost because you're using the device so much more often. The Italians, it turned out, at least in the regions where I gathered my data, which were in Udine and Pordenone and in Modena, a number of their teachers told me that parents had in the last couple of years said, we'll pay for all your expenses for everything, but you're going to pay for your own mobile phone. Now you're going to pay means we give you the money, but you have to pay the bill. And they have figured out these ingenious ways. You know, some of it is beeping, some of it is you have 2 handsets and they each have a different SIM card, so you don't have the inconvenience of having to swap out your card. This plan is cheaper for texting, this is cheaper for talking, and so forth, so that you can use your money for other things. Okay. Japan, there was a lot of talk about internet functions because there is, you know, with Docomo and its competitors, there's just a lot of use of the internet that had not permeated the West at the time I gathered the data. Plus a lot of complaints about poor keitai or mobile phone manners. They were the only people to say other people are rude, which sounds very Japanese to me. The Koreans, as we see, are the heaviest users of talking and texting. Okay. So instead of just summarizing the questions, I'll go to the questions. How often did people use instant messaging on a computer as opposed to texting on a mobile phone? That is, the question was asked of, do you do more IM on a computer, more texting on a phone, or is it about the same? And what you'll find is the Swedes slightly more IM on the computer, which is interesting because they've had mobile phones since the beginning of mobile phones, sort of 1991, 92, 93. But they said it's a pain in the neck to text. Now come on, this is an alphabet, a simple alphabet. But they said, I'd really rather do IM on the computer because they all had computers. It's been a computer-intensive society for quite a long time. In the United States, I was shocked to find that people would rather, and they said they would do more of, and they did more, texting on their mobiles than they do IM. Because texting was still relatively new in the United States. And they had all been on IM all the time. And they sort of changed on it, they turned on a dime to do texting. And I think there's a reason for that. Namely, you can control whether you want to communicate with someone else better on texting on a phone because it's asynchronous. Whereas if you're doing IM, in principle, it's synchronous. Italy, much more texting, because it's only recently that people have gotten computers. 4 years ago, I lectured in Italy and I said, so how many of you do instant messaging? Nobody knew what I was talking about in the university audience. And one of them said, oh, do you mean Messenger? I said, yeah, Messenger. Well, there were 2 out of 100. I was back lecturing in Italy last year. Everybody was doing IM on computers, but not as much as texting on their phones. And then you see for Japan and Korea, overwhelmingly, it's a communication system on the mobile or K-type. A bunch of statistics, and we won't go through all the details. I asked people to estimate yesterday how many calls or text messages did you send or receive, and I didn't separate between send and receive. The moral of the story is if you look at the column that says more than 11, you'll find there weren't that many Swedes who were doing that much communicating. You know, we say, well, they've had the technology for all this time, which starts me thinking, well, you use the technology if you need the technology, not just because you have it available. The Americans were using the technology more, and in fact, I thought they would be doing lots of talking, because the American plan, as those of you who are American or know about the United States know, has for the longest time been, you must buy, with a postpaid 2-year plan, a bucket of minutes. So you might as well talk with them because it used to cost more for texting. Now there are texting plans, not everybody had them, but still they were doing, when they were doing frequent communication, it was more in the United States with texting than with voice. In Italy, in Japan, you'll see the heavy communication is with texting. Korea did a lot of talking, but even more texting. So the Koreans, 17% of the Koreans had 11 or more voice calls the day before, 81% had 11 or more text messages shared. Okay. A question that I asked was, if you're deciding to text rather than talk, how important is the following reason? I want to keep my message short. So we had very important, somewhat important, not very important, not important at all. It was a 4-point scale. And if you just look at the total, which puts together the very important and the somewhat important, what you find is the Western countries, Sweden, the US, Italy, have almost 3/4 of the respondents saying, yeah, that's a reasonably important, maybe it's a very important, but it's a fairly important desideratum for my saying, yeah, I'm going to send a text. In Japan and in Korea, a little less than 50%. It's less important as a reason. Is that because there are other reasons for deciding to text? And to some extent it's true, because in Japan it has not been polite in many contexts to talk on your phone, but you could text and so forth. So there may be other factors involved, but there's a real separation between the Far East and the West. Pretending to talk to avoid acquaintances, people you know, or to avoid strangers. So I asked how many of you do this at least once a week, at least once a month, occasionally, never, those sorts of things. So when I put together at least once a week and at least once a month, how many people wanted to avoid strangers? What percent of the respondents? In Sweden, so we'll start with acquaintances first. In Sweden, only 4% avoided an acquaintance, and 4% avoided strangers by pretending to talk. And when I asked my Swedish students, oh, tell me about this, and they said, strangers don't come up to you, so you don't have to avoid them. So there's a cultural issue. Compare that with the United States, where 13% of the Americans said, yeah, at least once a month, I avoid someone by saying, equivalent of, yeah, I'm on the phone, I can't talk, don't bother me. I'm not crossing the street, I'm just pointing to my phone. But 15% did it to avoid strangers. Strangers will come up to you in the United States. In Italy, avoid acquaintances, 2%. Italy is much more of a social talk culture. You don't avoid people you know, for better or worse. And that's a gross overgeneralization. I realize this. I'm looking at some of the Italians in the audience. We can talk about it. But comparatively speaking, you find differences. But avoiding strangers, 8%. Acquaintances, 6% of Japanese. Avoiding acquaintances, 6% avoiding strangers. A little more in Japan, a little more in Korea, 9% and 9%.